To Bible Mornings. I am Greg, and I'm glad that you are with us this morning. Thanks for jumping in. We're going to look at Ephesians 6 this morning, which means we are almost done with the book of Ephesians. This is the very last chapter, and this might be our last week in Ephesians. So if you have thoughts on what we should do next, go ahead and shoot me a comment on the YouTube channel here or on Facebook or however else you can get in touch with me. Go ahead and send me a note on what you would like to study when we're through with Ephesians. I will limit it a little bit because I want to make sure the book is not too long and that it doesn't require way too much research on my end, because I do not have access to my library right now because we're in the middle of moving. So I may not accept every suggestion, but I will pick something and we'll sort of go from there. All right, I'm glad you're with us. Let's start this morning in prayer, like we do every morning as we approach Scripture, to make sure our hearts and our minds are in the right place. So this is the prayer we say every morning. So go ahead and join me in this prayer. From the cowardice that dares not face new truth, from the laziness that is contented with half truth, from the arrogance that thinks it knows all truth, good Lord, deliver us. And now we're in Ephesians 6, starting in verse 1. We got a very small section to cover today. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. And fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. All right. That's our reading for this morning, and honestly, if I'm being totally sincere with you guys, this is one of my personally most difficult passages in Ephesians. I know that the husband and wife one can be tricky, and the one that comes after this can be very tricky, but for me individually in my spiritual life, this has been one that has sort of hung over and haunted me my entire life, I guess. As a child, this passage seemed to be do everything your parents tell you all the time. And as a parent, do not provoke your children to anger seems like a reasonable thing to say until you have children, and then it seems entirely unreasonable. So let's unpack this just a little bit. This may not be quite as long as it normally is. We'll see. The first thing I want to say is, and this is really, 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 really important, just like the husband and wife stuff, all of this falls in the same category in Ephesians. This all falls under the heading of submit to each other out of reverence for Christ, right? Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. This passage and the passage before it and the passage after it are going to assume that you live life together as part of being a follower of Jesus. That's just the truth of it, right? That this assumes that the church of God, that God's church is made up of children and parents and husbands and wives and single people and married people and old people and young people. And this is raising the question, like, well, how do we do that? How do we be together the right way? How do we be together in a way that produces life and brings faithfulness? That's really an important question. And it's actually it's not surprising when you sort of frame the question that way that Paul spends some time on that in Ephesians, right? We're starting Ephesians 6. You should know, and we've talked about this before, maybe just in passing, but these chapter breaks and these verse breaks did not exist in the original manuscripts. There's something we've added to be able to find our way around. And because they kind of make sense to us, and sometimes they make more sense than other times, this is one where I think the chapter break probably hurts us. Because our impulse is to think Paul was talking about husbands and wives, and now he's done talking about husbands and wives. So now he's talking about children and parents, and then he's going to finish talking about that. He's going to move, but they're all part of the same piece in Ephesians. Like, they're all part of what we've been calling this household code, right? And I got that from some different New Testament guys a long time ago. But the idea is that Paul has just sort of moved the conversation, right? That the conversation in chapters 2, 3, and 4 is about this amazing work that God has done in the world that produces the coming together and the uniting over what had been division, right? And now chapters 5 and 6 move the focus of that conversation, not the topic. The topic is still this sort of reconciling and coming together where there's been division, but it moves the focus of that topic and conversation into something very specific. So it moves it into the Christian household, right? And a household is very different in the first century than a home is now in most parts of the West, at least, right? That our homes tend to be sort of isolated, small nuclear places, right? Like they're the place where just our family lives. But a household in the ancient Near East would have been much more fluid than that in terms of boundaries and stuff. So he's just giving rules. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. This is not a new command, right? He actually points that out. He says, for this is right? This is what you're supposed to do. This is the way the world's been designed and ordered, right? Honor your father and mother is the first command with a promise. He reminds them that this is actually one of the 10 commandments. Paul does this actually surprisingly little. For as big a deal as we think the 10 commandments are, and they probably are, Paul doesn't use them hardly ever. They're just not a huge thing for him. But he does use it here, and he reminds children, do this, right? Obey your parents, but not just because it's right, although it is, right? He says, for this is right. But remember that it comes with a promise, right? That if you obey your parents in the Lord, then your life just goes better, right? You may live long on the earth. That's not guaranteed, right? It's not one of those 100% if you do everything your parents tell you to do, you will not have any problems. The other hard part with these passages, and I really don't know a way around this, is that our impulse is to immediately personalize it to our stories, right? So if you had amazing parents and you hear children obey your parents, you're like, yeah, that makes sense. My parents were full of wisdom. They constantly led me in the right direction, and I get that. Like, I should obey my parents. I should have obeyed my parents more than I did, right? And that's one way to hear this passage. But a lot of you grew up with bad parents, and when you hear this passage, you hear some oppression in here, right? That my parents were actually really dangerous for me. My parents were really bad parents. And I get that, right? So let's not personalize this that way, at least not initially. Let's just say, okay, in general, Paul's naming that it's good for children to obey parents, and it's good for parents to give good direction to children. And that's the very next thing Paul's going to do. And he says, fathers, and I think it's okay to add mothers because he's clearly talking about parents here. Do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Okay, so rather than constantly making them angry and making them hate you, instead, raise up your children in a way that they know the discipline and instruction of the Lord. It'd be really fun to sort of unpack what that discipline and instruction of the Lord means. I don't know for sure, and I don't have like a book on it that tells me here are the 7 disciplines of the Lord or the 9 instructions of the Lord or something like this. But when you read the Old Testament, and when you read like Hebrews 12, for example, it would be a really good cross-reference to this passage. The discipline of the Lord is one of those things that God uses to sort of grow us into the people that God's called us to be. And that's true across the board. And when you read the Psalms and the Proverbs and you look at the way this phrase gets used, this discipline of the Lord, it's almost never something that feels good at the time, right? But it's important, right? That we learn pretty quickly that the wise person does not reject the discipline and instruction of the Lord, but the fool does. The fool keeps having to be disciplined over and over and over again. All right, children, obey your parents. Parents, don't provoke your children to anger. These are the same kinds of things as wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives. They're in this same list. They're in this same piece. Paul's trying to describe how is life going to go better. How is our life together going to produce the kind of fruit that we're called to? That's all that's going on in this passage. We don't need to use this passage to do anything really negative here, guys. That's not what's going on. That's not what Paul has in mind. How are you going to live together? That's the question. This is one of the answers to that question. All right, that's what we got for this morning. Thank you for joining us here on Bible Mornings. We're almost done with Ephesians. Send me your suggestions. Share this around. I I'm really having fun in Ephesians. I'm happy to be done with Ephesians also, but this has been a good time. I've really enjoyed this. So share this around, recommend it to friends, pass it along, all of that kind of stuff. All right, we'll see you tomorrow, guys. Be on the lookout for what the discipline and instruction of the Lord might look like in your life. See you tomorrow.